Hello, greetings, people of the rain who have braved it here today, and welcome to Lecture 8 in the Politics of Religion. So for the previous couple of lectures, we've been looking at secularization and then the politics of no religion, or more specifically the politics of new atheism. And the next two lectures examine the relationship between religion and the state, starting today with the issue of secularism. And this is a highly relevant topic in lots of ways. So, for instance, it cuts across a whole range of debates. So, for example, there are issues around free speech and expression, whether or not it's appropriate, for example, to print religiously offensive cartoons or write novels that would be regarded as offensive to religion. In the case of Salman Rushdie, for example, who obviously recently survived an assassination attempt. Then there are issues, some of which we'll talk about today, around religious clothing, such as bans on wearing the burqa, for instance. Then there's also ongoing issues around public policy, which we haven't got to yet, but we touch upon in term 2, such as abortion rights, issues of religious freedom, the legalization of same-sex marriage, issues of assisted dying, and so on. And so there's a whole range of things that come into this debate around secularism, and broadly speaking, the debate tends to polarize opinion. So on the one hand, you've got secularists who, generally speaking, want to see religion kept out of the public sphere, although I say generally because this does depend on the type of secularism you're talking about, which we will, we'll see shortly. And on the other side, we have supporters of religion who think that religion should have a more active role in public life. And usually the arguments there, by the way, tap into all the stuff we were talking about earlier in the term around morality and religion, right? So the general idea being that religion is a source of morality, inspires people to do good things. Why wouldn't you want more of that in public life? That's generally how the argument goes. So this is what I'm going to talk about today, and this is the plan. First of all, I'm going to talk about the concept of secularism, so what it is, how it's defined, how it works, and so on. Then I'm going to discuss some of the main varieties of secularism, focusing on France, the United States, and India. And then for the second half of the lecture, I'm going to run through some of the key arguments for and against secularism. But before I get onto any of this, there are two quick administrative points that I need to just rattle through. Point number one is that I need to give you a full disclaimer for transparency, which is that I am a secularist. This is not exactly a secret. If there's anybody who reads any of my stuff might kind of glean the impression, I have written articles and reports in support of secularism. And in 2017, I was shortlisted for the, which I'm never going to start going on about, I was shortlisted for the Secularist of the Year award by the National Secularist Society, which I didn't win. Otherwise, you'd have heard about it before now, because I would talk about it all the time. But I did at least make the Champions League places. So that, for me, was pretty good. I'm flagging this up, by the way, just so you can assess that during the rest of the lecture, whether or not I'm being biased one way or the other, right? So for full transparency, that's where I stand on this topic. And secondly, just a reminder of this, again, secularization is not secularism, right? They are different things. Do not mix them up in your essays. Okay, so secularism then. What is it? Well, the term was invented, as a matter of fact, by this guy, George Holyoake, in 1851, in a book which was called, as you can see, The Principles of Secularism. And he used it at this point. Actually, you can't see it because it hasn't turned up on my slides, which is very handy. But if it had been working, you would see nicely written across the bottom of that slide, The Principles of Secularism. And I just hope my other slides are working, otherwise that's going to be a problem. But he defined it initially as an ethical system for promoting human welfare and human well-being, making... well, let me just show you the quote, if it works. Here we go. This is how he described it. Secularism was the study of promoting human welfare by material means, making the service of others a duty of life. It was generally an ethical, moral approach to how somebody ought to live their life. This is not how secularism is understood today. Today, the term is understood as being about the relationship between religion and the state. And typically, this breaks down into three key elements. I've no idea what's going on with these slides today. I used a different piece of software to go over them this morning. It's obviously messed it up, so I won't be using that again. But anyway, these are the three main principles of secularism. So first of all, we have the separation of church and state is usually the way in which it gets described, right? And this is often interpreted as keeping religion out of politics, which of course it is, but importantly, it's also about keeping religion out of politics. It's about keeping politics out of religion. It's not just about separating religion from the state, it's about making sure the state itself can't interfere in religious affairs. But the basic principle here is that religious groups and individuals should not be restricted in what they want to do, but nor should they have any special privileges. In other words, the state should be neutral on religious affairs. Although, as we'll see, not all secular states actually follow this, and how neutrality is defined is one of the sort of key points of this entire debate. But anyway, that's principle number one. The second key principle is freedom of religion and freedom of non-religion. So essentially, people should have the freedom to practice and change their faith, or not to have a faith. And then finally, we have equality before the law, which basically means that nobody should get any special treatment or disadvantage because of their religious views or lack thereof. So that's basically what secularism boils down to. Now, for critics of secularism, this is often presented as an anti-religious ideology or some kind of doctrine or a political program that's designed to force religion out of public life. As you can see here, this is a quote from Brett Scharfs, who describes secularism as a misguided, dangerous ideology that, if we just let it run free and do its own thing, will degenerate into some kind of dystopian fundamentalism. So, fair to say, Brett's not a fan of secularism, I think. But the principles of secularism, as I have intimated, can play out in various different ways. And one of the interesting things about all of this is that there is no single kind of secularism. When people speak of secularism, you can sometimes get the impression that there is just this, that's it, there's this one thing. You get it off the shelf and you use it, or you do whatever you like with it. But that's not how it works at all. We have these general principles of secularism, and then when they get filtered down through the lens of culture and society and politics and all the rest of it, you end up with various different types in the real world. So around about half the countries in the world, roughly speaking, claim to have secularism as their guiding constitutional principle, but secular states in practice have a variety of institutional arrangements. And it's difficult sometimes to know whether a state is actually secular or not. So I'll give you two very quick examples here. The UK is not a secular state, at least at the level of law and politics. The head of state, Charlie Boy, is a monarch, obviously, who is also the head of the established church, Church of England, and members of the Church of England have guaranteed seats in the upper house of the legislature, i.e. the House of Lords. There are only two countries in the world that do this. The other one is Iran. But in other areas of life, once you get beyond the level of politics and law and you go down to levels of, culture and society, the UK is largely secular, right? Religious influence is generally sort of limited in many spheres, and people are pretty much free to do whatever they choose with respect to their religious or non-religious beliefs. On the other side of the coin, however, is Russia, which is formally secular. The constitution says that religion and the state are separate, but in practice, the Russian Orthodox Church exerts a significant influence over Russian cultural and social life, and has very close links to the Putin regime, One reason, of course, being that it's very nice if you are in the Putin regime to have the kind of religious legitimation for all of the kinds of things that you want to get up to. So the practicalities then of secularism can vary from place to place, and the way in which secularism works in any particular country is strongly influenced by the historical circumstances involved. So, for instance, France has been officially secular since 1905. I think the exact law was called something like the Law on the Separation of Churches and the State, which is pretty much obvious what it's doing, and it's often described as a hard form of secularism, and it's known as laicité. Now, this is shaped. You can't see it. Why doesn't it say France? That's really, you'd know it's France by the bloody flag. But I mean, it should say the word France at the bottom. Anyway, apologies for my complete slide disaster today. The form of secularism in France is shaped by its historic conflict with the Catholic Church, which came to a head most dramatically, of course, in the French Revolution of 1789, and is based on the idea that the public sphere. And this is another thing, by the way. So, you talk about the role of religion in the public sphere, and a lot of this also depends on what you mean by the public sphere. So that's another thing that people define in different ways, right? And there's another way of looking at it, which we'll see fairly shortly. But in France, the public sphere is pretty much defined as anything outside your front door. That's the public. You're walking down the street, you're in the public sphere, right? You're going through a park, you're in the public sphere. You're in a school, you're in the public sphere, right? In your living room, no, but everywhere else you are. And so the idea in France is that the public sphere should be kept free of religion. And in this case, religion is seen as a divisive force in society and a potential threat to the stability of the French Republic. And so because of these historical circumstances, the French view of secularism sees the state as being the guardian of the values of the Republic. And so because of this, the state then claims the right to intervene in religious affairs in order to uphold the values of individual freedom and equality. But this has given rise to some pretty contentious cases, none of which you can read about here because they're all obviously invisible. You can download the slides, by the way, from Moodle, and hopefully those versions are working. If they're not, let me know, and I will go and correct them and get the original set of slides up for this new Office suite. Obviously messed them all up, and I'll re-upload them, and it'll be fixed. But the wording across the bottom that you can't see here essentially just says a ban on conspicuous religious symbols. And the point of this is that, well, in 2004, this was introduced by the French state, right? There was a ban on the display of what they called conspicuous religious symbols in schools. And this meant that Muslim pupils were no longer allowed to wear their headscarves. In 2010, the French government extended this to a ban on all full-face veils, including niqabs and burqas, in public spaces. Now, supporters of these measures will say that this is necessary to ensure that all citizens in France are treated equally. So one argument here, for example, is that things like the burqa are oppressive to women, and that any conspicuous religious symbols, if you're walking down the street dressed religiously, another person can identify you as being a member of a particular faith, and they may then treat you differently because you are a member of that faith. So by taking that self-declaration out of the picture, this ensures that everybody gets equal treatment. That's the argument. Critics, of course, say that this is, these laws are discriminatory and essentially they're an attack on religious and individual freedom. The ban also creates a sort of paradoxical situation. This would say a paradoxical situation. You're just going to have to use the, I'm doing this through the sort of, what would we call it? This is basically, I'm miming to you today. And so this creates a paradoxical situation. Because on the one hand, the French state is insisting that religion is a private affair, right? Religion cannot have a role in public life because it's essentially a private thing and it needs to be kept to the private sphere. So religion is fundamentally privatized in France. But on the other hand, the French state imposes restrictions on what religious citizens can and can't do in ways that many people would regard as intrusive. So there's an obvious tension here between individual freedom on the one hand and the desire of the French state on the other hand to keep religion out of public life. In contrast to this is the Indian model, which is often described as an example of soft or inclusive secularism. And India has been formally secular since 1976, and unlike France, where secularism was based on opposition to religion, Indian secularism was driven by the need to deal with the challenges of having a highly religious population. So while la cité, French secularism, aims to keep religion out of public life, Indian secularism allows all religions to enter public life. The key point here, glad this quote worked, is what Rajiv Bhargava calls an idea of principled distance. Now, I'm not going to read the whole quote to you, but essentially the point here is that the Indian state needs to treat all religions with equal tolerance and fairness, right? As he puts it, a secular state shows critical respect to all religious and philosophical worldviews, and this is possible only when it maintains a specific distance between them. In other words, the French state intervenes to make sure that religion stays in its place, whereas Indian secularism is about allowing all religions to participate equally in public life. And so there's a key difference, if you think back to what I was saying earlier on about this idea of neutrality. The French state defines neutrality towards religion very differently to the French state. So we still have this commitment to neutrality in respect of religion, but it depends on what you mean by neutrality and how that plays out in practice. So in this context then, the Indian state, or the idea is that the Indian state should only intervene in order to maintain the overall balance, in order to maintain an equal playing field between all religions, to make sure that no single religion can come to dominate public life. Now, I'm sure you're all ahead of me on this point because, that's obviously not how it has worked out in India, and the theory and the practice here don't always go together. And so in recent years, the ruling party of India, BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party, have politicized religion and have promoted a strident form of Hindu nationalism, which has led to rising social tensions and violence against and discrimination towards religious minorities. Now, a third example of secularism that doesn't comfortably fit between these kind of hard and soft or, inclusive, exclusive versions is secularism in the United States. And unfortunately, you can only see half of the quote here, so I'll go through it for you anyway. The United States is the first country in the world to declare itself secular, to adopt a secular constitution. And this was enshrined in the First Amendment, which was ratified in 1791, and it declares that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, we'll come back to this formulation later on. When we get to the topic on religion and the law, this is quite a crucial piece of text, because essentially what we've got here are two particular ideas being squished together. You've got, on the one hand, the idea that the state cannot make any law favouring or disfavouring religion, right, and that plays out in one direction. But on the other hand, we've got the free exercise clause, which basically says people can do whatever the hell they want in respect of religion, and the state can't tell them otherwise. Those two things don't always fit together very well. It leads to lots of interesting legal cases, which we'll see in term 2. But the point for now is that the US Constitution, unlike France, does not allow any state interference in religious affairs, so it would be unconstitutional, although, of course, the boundaries now are obviously being pushed all over the place here, but it would be unconstitutional, at least, in the United States to ban the public wearing of the burqa, as they have done in France, because that would breach the free exercise clause. Now, like India, secularism in the United States was also driven by a need to secure peaceful coexistence between a diversity of religious viewpoints. And so the typical story here is that secularism in the United States was based on the values of religious freedom. So the United States, obviously, so the narrative goes, was founded by migrants who were fleeing wars and persecution in Europe. So there was lots of religious persecution taking place in Europe. People were driven out. They went to the colonies. They went to the New World. They started a new life, kick-started America, one of the most successful startups in human history. That's generally the impression that you get, right? It was all about enshrining religious freedom. The reality, though, was slightly different to this. Now, it is true, of course, that many migrants did go to the New World to escape religious persecution, but many also went because they wanted to set up their own religious communities. And in those religious communities, they wanted to be free, essentially, to discriminate against other people who did not fit into their group. And so many of these religious communities that were established in the colonies had extensive restrictions on religious liberty. And we can see this, for example, in some of the religious requirements for public office that are still technically on the books in many parts of the United States. Now, these would be deemed unconstitutional, perhaps, if they went to the Supreme Court, although who knows what the Supreme Court would do these days. So they're still there in the texts of the state-level constitutions, even though they are unconstitutional. So we can see, for example, the Constitution of Maryland says that no religious test ought ever to be required as a qualification for any office other than, which is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, other than a declaration of belief in the existence of God. Now, to be fair, it doesn't say that you actually have to believe in God, it just says you have to say that you believe in God, so maybe that's a sort of workaround in that particular case. Or then we have the Constitution of South Carolina, which is more sort of blunt about these things. It says, no person who denies the existence of a supreme being shall hold any public office. And there are others as well, right? I'm obviously not going to belabor you with the list of them, but you can find quite a lot of these things floating around in the legal system. So the important point to note here is that the First Amendment, the text here just says religious conflict in the colonies. You have to imagine it for yourself. The important point here is that the First Amendment was passed not from a desire to preserve religious freedom and to extend religious freedom to people out of some sort of benevolent, viewpoint. It was a way of dealing with conflicts between different religious groups. And secularism was supported, and in fact it wouldn't have happened without the support of evangelical Christians. Which is weird, given the journey that evangelical Christians as a block, and obviously, you can't really homogenize everybody, but evangelical Christians today are one of the most strident opponents of secularism in the United States. And the reason they supported it initially was because they realized that not having secularism would lead to negative consequences for them, because they were a religious minority in many parts of the United States. And so if we didn't have laws preventing religious discrimination and the state being able to do whatever, then a religious majority in a particular state could pass laws that were detrimental to evangelical Christians. So you could have religious tests for office, for example. Or some colonies, in fact, had compulsory church attendance, right? And you do not want your kids growing up being forced to go to the church that you think is of the wrong religion, right? So clearly secularism is in your advantage if that situation arises. Some colonies forced citizens to pay taxes to support their official church, and so on and so forth, right? So secularism was beneficial for religious minorities in the United States, and so therefore they supported the First Amendment, and this is how it happened. Now again, as with France and India, there are also ongoing flashpoints around secularism in the United States. You can insert your own caption here, probably better than mine, and ironically, given that evangelicals were one of the supporters of secularism, the Christian right, at least, or Christian nationalists as they seem to have sort of morphed into, are now engaged in a intensive operation to essentially, and I don't think this is a bit of an exaggeration to say this, to essentially take over the United States government and impose their own theocratic values on American society. This is sort of Project 2025 and all of that. And this includes obviously things like, restrictions on LGBT rights, scrapping Roe v. Wade, promoting greater powers for religious organisations, and so on and so forth. And we will, of course, return to these factors in later weeks. So, these are some of the different ways in which the principles of secularism, which seem on the face of it to be fairly straightforward, and then when you kind of apply it into practice, it can go off into various different directions. And these are some illustrative examples of how that works. But are critics of secularism, like Brett Schaaf's, right to say that all of this amounts to some kind of anti-religious ideology? Well, to assess all of this, I'm going to run through the three main arguments, or in my view, the three main arguments on either side of this argument, the debate. So I want to give you the arguments for and against secularism. And to avoid any impression of bias, I'm going to put the arguments against secularism last. So they will appear to be the strongest. This is the Hollywood courtroom drama thing, right? If ever you watch any Hollywood courtroom drama, the person who goes last always wins, right? So I'm putting these arguments last to make them seem like they're the strongest, even though they're not, and they're wrong. But I'm doing it, so I'm being transparent and unbiased about all of this. Okay, so the first argument then in favour of secularism is the argument from religious privilege. And one argument that is commonly made by supporters of secularism is that it's just unfair for religious organisations and members of religious groups to enjoy privileges that are not open to all citizens equally. One obvious example of this, we've seen it earlier on, is the case of bishops of the Church of England being given seats in the House of Lords. Now, by the way, just as a slight aside here, leaving aside all the stuff about the House of Lords being a sort of undemocratic, antiquated, out-of-date institution, and putting all of that to one side, the problem isn't that there are bishops in the House of Lords, right? If you're going to have a system where people get appointed to the House of Lords, it may well be the case that there are certain bishops who are particularly good at particular things, and they would be a good addition to the House of Lords, right? So secularists don't say there should never be bishops in the House of Lords. The problem is that the bishops are in the House of Lords because they're bishops, right? And for no other reason. That's the tripping line. And so, they get to vote on laws that affect every single person in the country just because they are bishops, and that, is said to be unfair. Another example is the case of the church tax, which is enacted in places like Italy, Finland, Austria, Germany has a church tax, where anybody registered as being Christian, and I think in Germany it's Jewish as well, has to pay a tax which is around 8 or 9%, it varies slightly across the country, of their income to the church. And this is no small beer, right? In 2022, which were the latest figures I could find, Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany gained 13 billion euros from the church tax. Other examples of religious privilege that come up quite a lot include things like exemptions and opt-outs for religious organisations from legal restrictions. So, for example, you'll have opt-outs from equalities legislation on employment grounds, or opt-outs from social service provision legislation, or opt-outs, this comes up quite a lot as well, on legislation around animal welfare. So there are ongoing debates about the religious slaughter of animals, for example, or tax exemptions, so religious groups that are given charitable status, or, and we talk about this, of course, in Term 2 as well, the involvement of religious organisations in the education system. So there are lots of debates around faith schools, and for example, just one of the things that, and we'll see in much more detail, of course, in Term 2, but faith schools are allowed to select students and staff members on religious grounds, and so supporters of secularism say, well, that's unfair, you're essentially discriminating against people on the basis of their religion, or in this case, non-religion. So that's argument number one. Argument number two is the argument from human rights. And the argument here is that religion produces negative social consequences, notably in terms of prejudice, intolerance, and violence. And we can see this in cases, for example, of religious violence like 9/11 or sectarian violence in places like Northern Ireland, for example, or tensions between India and Pakistan. Nigeria is another one. We also have issues of discrimination around attitudes towards gender orientation, or even gender in some cases, free speech, reproductive rights, and so on. And so supporters of secularism then say that keeping religion out of political affairs provides the best way of ensuring human rights and freedoms for all citizens equally before the law. And this is a really important point because, as I said earlier on, secularism is often seen as being anti-religious, but there are lots of religious people who are also secularists, right? It's entirely possible to be religious and a secularist at the same time, particularly where people belong to a religious minority, right? I was talking a few minutes ago about the case of the United States. If you're a religious minority in a country and there is the risk that, your rights are going to be eroded by the majority, secularism is in your interests. And so, as we've seen in the case of India and the United States, right? Those countries were not secular because they were anti-religious. They're secular because they're highly religious. They have such a religious diversity and such a highly religious population that secularism, as it came into existence in those parts of the world, was seen to be the best way of ensuring stability, security, and equality for everybody. So that would be argument number 2. Argument number 3 is slightly more philosophical. This is the argument from public reason. And those of you who do political theory stuff will know some of this. And I don't know I don't know what the timetable is for political theory, so you might have got to it already. I don't know, but so I apologise if I'm repeating things here. But this is essentially one of the most influential philosophical arguments for secularism. And it was initially made by the political theorist John Rawls. And Rawls claimed that arguments and claims and discourse in the public sphere, and again, how do you define the public sphere, right? John Rawls defined it as being the courts, the government, and candidates for public office. So if you're standing for election and you're going up and you're doing a talk, right, that's the public sphere, right? So that was how he defined it. And he said that all language in the public sphere should be conducted using what he called public reason. The German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, by the way, calls this secular reason. So basically converges on this, but it essentially means the same thing. And so public reason, or secular reason, is a criteria for discourse that the majority of people in a society, religious and non-religious, can understand. It's a common framework for public deliberation. It's the language that people can use to communicate with each other and to deliberate over certain ideas, whether they're talking about politics or anything else that might influence public life. So Rawls argued that in a pluralist democracy, right? This was essentially this is why it's important to have public reason. In a pluralist democracy, where citizens have a range of views and a range of different, argumentative positions, and they'll be antithetical to each other, and you have different religious views and, non-religious views and everything else, right? You've got a complete melting pot of opinions and political positions and ideas. In that situation, you're going to get incompatible worldviews, which is what he called comprehensive doctrines. And in other words, when you put this in the case of religion, the point is that you can only understand the language of religion if you think about things like sin, for example, right? Or salvation. They only really make sense to somebody who is a member of and a believer of that religious group. Those ideas don't translate outside of that community. And so if people use those ideas in political discourse, that is impeding the deliberation of political ideas, because other people won't be able to understand fully what is meant by those religious arguments. So in order to circumvent that problem, you should have public reason, which provides a common language that everybody can use. Richard Rorty called this, or called religious language, a conversation stopper. This was his famous quote on it. Because essentially, once somebody starts introducing religious language into a political argument, it basically boils down to God says so. And once somebody says, because God says so, I mean, where do you go from there, right? There's nothing else to talk about. That's the end of the conversation. You can say, well, I don't think God says so, or I don't believe in God, whatever, right? But there is nothing to debate at that point, because that's the final dividing line. And so because of this, the argument is that religious language is not accessible to all citizens. Now, Rawls later modified his position slightly. He did. His kind of revised version of the public reason criteria was that people could use religious arguments in public life for political debates, as long as, at some future point, not too far away, they came back with secular arguments, right? So ultimately you had to have public reason. So somebody could say, for example, I disagree with abortion because it goes against my religious principles, and I believe that, life is sacred and God put us all here for a reason, and therefore, we shouldn't take the life of an unborn child. And so that would be a religious argument. Now, that would be fine, but then you'd have to come back later on and say, okay, now the secular reasons why I think this are ... Right? You couldn't just leave it hanging with the religious argument. So you could use them, but ultimately you had to come back and ground them in something that everybody could understand, in a common language of public reason. So those, I think, are the three strongest, or at least most commonly used arguments for secularism. Here are the arguments against secularism. The first is called the argument from asymmetry. And the main point here is that it takes issue with this public reason criteria. So it's basically a rebuttal to Rawls and Habermas. And there are two parts to this argument. The first is that the requirement to use public reason is unreasonable. So the claim here is that if a religious person has to convert their, so to speak, their religious language into secular language, they have a greater cognitive burden than non-religious citizens. Because non-religious citizens are not going to use religious language, right? So they're automatically speaking the common language of public reason that everybody can understand. It's only religious believers who need to go away and think up secular reasons, right? So they have an extra cognitive, psychological load that other citizens don't have. So this is unfair, right? Because they have sort of more work to do to take part in the public conversation. So that's one criticism. Second criticism is that the second criticism is basically this, right? The public reason criteria expects people to lie, right? Or encourages people to lie, and it promotes dishonesty. Because, think about it, right? If religion shapes all aspects of a person's life, it shapes their identity, their worldview, their sense of who they are, how they see the world, their political positions, their social attitudes, if it's central to their very being, then banning that from public life essentially forces those individuals to set aside or disguise their real beliefs and motivations when they enter public life. It's like saying, you're a religious person, but when you come to work, you have to forget you're a religious person, or when you're taking part in political debates, you have to put all that to one side and pretend to be somebody else. So you're essentially being inauthentic when you take part in political life. And so, to this extent then, secularism, or the public reason criteria at least, is said to violate the moral agency of religious citizens. It forces them to behave in ways that are contrary to their deeply held principles and convictions. So that would be argument number one. Argument number two against secularism is the argument from liberal fairness. And this claims that religious worldviews and religious perspectives are no different from political and ideological worldviews and perspectives, such as socialism or conservatism, liberalism, or even secularism. And that religious ideas, because of this, should therefore be permitted entry into public life on liberal grounds. In other words, in an open society, people should be free to make whatever arguments they like, in whatever context they want to make them. And banning arguments from the public square just because you happen not to like them is, obviously illiberal, authoritarian, impedes free speech, right? It's essentially cancel culture. I mean, I hate that phrase, but this is kind of what it is, right? And importantly, even leaving that aside, if you restrict the free flow of ideas, you're impeding public debate. You're degrading the quality of public debate, because there are certain ideas and certain ways of expressing things that you're not going to hear because they're being shut out of public life. And on top of this, liberal democracies allow all kinds of views and political elements to take part in public discourse, right, including views and elements that some people would find pretty obnoxious. So the argument goes then, if you're going to allow people like this to take part in public life with all the attendant kind of language that goes along with that, right? And you all know what I mean. Why then would you single out religion? It seems weird to pick on religious individuals when you have all this other stuff going on, and that stuff is fine. In conjunction with this, it's also sometimes claimed that liberal arguments themselves are like religion. In other words, based on unprovable claims about the world. So a good example of this is the idea of human rights. So the claim would be that human beings have inalienable rights, right? The right to liberty, right to freedom, right to life, and so on, right? That presumably most people, hopefully everybody in this room, signs up to. And this is a key tenet of liberalism, of course, right? But the argument here is that, well, essentially that's just a matter of faith, right? It's not an objective fact. It's an idea that people have invented. It might be a bloody good idea, and we might all agree with it, and we might all like it, but it's still an idea. And so the argument along this point then goes, well, there's no grounds then for, you can't prove that human rights are inalienable, right? That's just a belief that people have and promote. And so if there are no provable empirical evidence for this, why then would you then pick on religion because it has the, unprovable aspects to it? Like when somebody says, because God says I should do this. And so, yes, again, keeping religion out of public life on those grounds is said to be illiberal and undemocratic. The final argument against secularism here is the myth of neutrality. And this claims that the so-called neutrality of secularism, I've been kind of saying throughout this lecture, right, that this principle of neutrality, which is at the centre of what secularism is, can be interpreted in very, very different ways in very, very different contexts, right? And some states will interpret it one way and others will have a completely different take on it. The argument here is that it's simply impossible to be neutral, right? The very idea of neutrality is itself a myth. And the reason for this, as we saw at the very beginning of the module, when we were going through this concept of religion and how religion is defined, and obviously it's in very abstract terms, and people think, well, that might be interesting, but what the hell is the real life application of this? Well, here's one of the real life applications of it, right? The point is that the boundary. So the claim there is that religion is a political construction, right, or a social construction. So is secularism. The boundary between the religious sphere and the public sphere, however you define them, is something that is socially constructed. They don't fall from the sky, right? You don't get them off the shelf. It's not pre-given. It's something that human beings have to decide for themselves. And so, because of this, the claim is that wherever you draw this line, this boundary between the religious sphere and the secular sphere, wherever you choose to draw it, you are inevitably going to be favouring some political viewpoints and some political relationships and power relations generally over others. There is no neutral space where you can draw this line. You're always going to favour some people and disfavour others. As Rex Adar puts it, and for a modern state to remain entirely impartial is an impossible feat. Secular liberal states cannot avoid taking sides. Now, one of the interesting parts about this argument, now obviously as a secularist I don't kind of buy all this stuff, but I do find I think this is really interesting, right? Because it goes to the heart of the secular, how we define the secular, and how we define, my slides are working, brilliant, and how we define the religious. They're mutually constitutive, all right? And so how it works is this: the process of making the secular sphere, if you're a secularist and you want to have a secular sphere, you have to define what it is, okay? Fine. In the process of defining what the secular sphere is, at the same time as you're doing that, that presupposes that you define what the religious sphere is. In order to have secularism, you have to have the religious. You have to say what the religious sphere is in order to say what it's not, right? Which is where the secular side goes. And this takes us back to the different views of religion that we started the module with. Again, if you remember, the substantive view of religion and the functional view of religion and the discursive view, of religion that I talked a little bit about and then never really got into. This is it, right? The discursive view of religion essentially says that it's something that is produced by society and it's something that's constantly negotiated as we go along. And so the point here then is that secularism needs to construct religion as an other in order to define itself. Now this again, you might think, well, it's intellectually sort of interesting and everything, but what practical implications does this have? It could seem to be something that only intellectual academics are remotely interested in. Well, it does have practical implications, right? So think back to, as I was talking minutes ago, about the case in France, right, with the ban on conspicuous religious symbols, or the ban on wearing religious clothing. So what we have here is the French state saying, this religion treats this particular item of clothing with a particular form of reverence or sacredness, right? This particular item of clothing is a religious thing. It falls into the category of religious stuff. Now that's a problem, right? Because not every Muslim agrees that the burqa or the hijab or the niqab is a religious thing, right? A lot of Muslims will say it's nothing to do with religion, really. It's a cultural thing, and lots of Muslims don't wear them. But the French state then comes along and says, no, Islam and headscarves, they are part of the same package, right? You cannot be a Muslim unless you believe in this stuff. So the French state is itself defining what Islam is and where the parameters of that particular religion are. And so this mutually constitutive idea, this discursive process of religion, has real-life practical implications. And so when secular states define religion, they do it in particular ways. There's three things typically that they do. First of all, they define religion as being something that's fixed and unchanging, which, as we know, is problematic. They also define religion as being propositional. So religion is typically about the beliefs in intellectual propositions, all of that stuff that the new atheists do, right? This is also tends to be the preserve of secular states. And they also tend to present religion, or at least frame it as being a matter of individual choice. So they treat religion as something that's private and individualized. And as we know, again, from our earlier discussions of how religion is defined and how the concept of religion was created and how it was made in the West and all the rest of it, all of these things are based on a particular view of religion, i.e. this Western Protestant view of religion. And that is where I am going to leave it for today. So, in the next lecture, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between religion and the state, focusing specifically on the ideas of political myths and nationalism and populism. So until then, thanks for coming, thanks for braving the weather, and I will see you all next time.